Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hi, I'm Kevin Bayuk, a partner and worker owner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Daniel Kurzrock. Daniel is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Upcycled Foods, Inc., or Up Inc., which developed, the flagship product, regrained super grain. It's an ingredient that we'll get into and talk about it in a moment that's part of the portfolio of Upcycled Foods. Daniel's also co-founded the nonprofit trade association, the Upcycled Food Association. Those of you who haven't heard the term upcycle before might be like, what is Kevin talking about? Well, Daniel's going to unpack it for us, I'm sure, in this interview. After undergraduate work at UCLA, Daniel received an MBA in Sustainable Business Management from the Presidio Graduate School. Really a delight to have Daniel here. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Kevin, stoked to be here. Thanks so much. And we actually met while you were a guest lecturer when I was doing my MBA at Presidio. So it's great to bring things full circle, as we like to say.
Full circles are good. And I bet we'll talk about circular economy today. So Daniel, what's your story? How did you get into this work? What brought you to what you're doing today?
Yeah, underage homebrewing is where it all began. So I learned how to make beer from a buddy in college. It was our freshman year of college. We were 19 years old, and he came back from winter break, and he said, "Dan, you're never going to believe this. We can go buy the ingredients to make our own beer. We don't need an ID or anything like that." And my uncle lent me his equipment, and that was the beginning of what became a very passionate hobby of mine, where every week we would make beer. Have you ever made beer before, Kevin? I know it's become pretty popular to do at home.
I've done it before, more kombucha these days, but yeah, I've brewed stuff.
Yeah. The healthier fermentation. I'm on pickles and sourdough these days. Was introduced to that world through making beer. And some of the listeners might not realize that beer is one of humanity's original products of the land. There's actually only 4 ingredients in beer. And, well, do you know what those are, Kevin?
Well, you'll have to give me it. Well, you need your malted grain, right? You definitely need water. Okay, I've got 2 down. At some point, you need some yeast. You need to get this stuff going and actually doing the...
There we go. Now we're at 3.
Help me out with the rest. Where do we go from there?
Hops. Hops are the final ingredient in traditional beer making. Yeah, so it's barley, water, hops, and yeast. And way at the beginning of the process, what you do is you kind of make a big batch of porridge. So you take the grains from that have been malted. So it's barley. Typically, the barley has been sprouted. And then you take the sprouted grains, you mix them with hot water, and you basically extract the sugars from that. And fermentation, for anyone who's into it, knows the yeast is taking sugar and converting it into alcohol and carbon dioxide in the case of beer making, which is where the carbonation comes from, which was all great. The only problem was making this beer every week is, we'd use about 1 pound of grain for every 6-pack. So we were brewing 5-gallon batches. That's about a third of a commercial keg, not a huge quantity of beer, but we'd use 20, 30, sometimes 40 pounds of grain to make those batches. And while I grew up in Northern California with a father that kept a vegetable garden and composted at home and a green bin as well that would get picked up by the city, I was down in Southern California, where at the time there was not municipal composting, let alone a vegetable garden, let alone farm animals to feed this stuff to, maybe some party animals. So what we did was, at first, the only option we had was to take the stuff down to the dumpster. And that felt very wasteful. It felt like I was making a big batch of oatmeal and tossing it out. So I started asking like a good undergraduate, started asking some questions. Hey, what is this? What do other people do with it? And what I learned really, really blew my mind and became the seed that has become my career. And what I learned was that in that process of extracting the sugars, what's left in this desugared barley is basically all the protein and fiber. There's actually a history of human consumption that goes back to Mesopotamia, even more recently in the Middle Ages. And there's even a modern proliferation of this on the menus of brew pubs and things like that around the country. Yet, when you go into a grocery store, Ralph's was the store of choice for us, Kroger banner. Walk down the bread aisle, you didn't see bread made with this stuff. You didn't see nutrition bars made with it, despite it being very healthy, very tasty, as I soon learned, very new, also having this great sustainability story. And so that led to a series of more questions that will probably unfold throughout this conversation around trying to reframe, how we think about this. What was originally, I was looking at the waste stream for my own hobby, but started asking the questions about industrially, what was happening. There's around 2 new breweries opening per day, at the time. And I thought I wanted to open a brewery originally until really the lights went on, for this much bigger opportunity to try to connect the dots between a very potentially valuable source of nutrition for humanity that was being undervalued and overlooked by the status quo. Became very inspired by the sustainability thinkers like Bill McDonough, for example, putting out Cradle to Cradle and the Upcycle. And this idea of upcycling, as early as 2011, 2012, was really inspired by kind of durable goods, if you will, side of the economy, the physical economy, where you've got materials that were, instead of sending them down to a lower use, you put them to a higher use. And examples of that commercially could include, things like the Patagonia fleeces that are made from water bottles, right? That's not recycling. You're not taking a plastic bottle and turning it back into another plastic bottle, which, by the way, very little plastic is, as some of the listeners of the show probably know, is actually fully recycled in that way. It's about taking things from the path of least resistance and putting them to the path of highest value. And saw an opportunity to do that with food, starting with, has conventionally been handled as a byproduct industrially by the brewing industry, about 80% going to animal feed, and trying to figure out what would need to happen in order to turn it into the next great healthy ingredient. And everything that we've done in the decade since this light bulb going off has been in pursuit of bringing that to life.
You mentioned a few things in there in that journey. I love the light bulb moments were illuminating for me in terms of the awareness. And upcycling as a concept, like you said, it's been around, but it is surprising that still today there is so much waste. I mean, in the food system, we know there's waste at many different parts of the food system. So, spoilage in the field, an aggregation point before transport, spoilage in transport, spoilage at market, and of course, what we take home, people don't eat. So and of course, in value adding and cutting and processing, there's all these parts that are left over. So what's the full potential here? Like, when we look at waste stream and upcycling, are we just looking at breweries and grain, or how have you taken this idea and where does it go from here?
Yeah, happy to put that all in perspective. So, by the way, the best source of data on food waste is an organization called ReFed, and they have a great tool online called the Food Waste Monitor that I don't even know how many hours I've spent in, and would encourage anyone listening to the show to go check out ReFed's Food Waste Monitor to slice and dice the data however strikes your fancy. Globally, we're wasting about 1/3 that's all of food. So a third of food that is produced is not eaten. In the US, it's closer to 40%, which is like the equivalent of leaving a grocery store with 5 bags and dropping 2 in the parking lot, right? So this is a tremendous amount of food. It's so much that it's actually quite hard to put in perspective, and it's a waste. And when food is wasted, it's not just a meal that's maybe missed, but it's all the embedded resources in the food. It's the labor, it is the cost, the money. Waste is money, right? And so when you zoom in to our initial commercial focus, which is on brewing and the barley that's used in that process, just to share some heuristics, it's about 1 pound of grain for every 6-pack of beer. In the US, that aggregates to about 20 billion pounds per year, which we did the math on this one time. If we were to convert that all into a product like our super grain powder, it's kind of like a flour, you could make like, what was it? It was like 130 loaves of bread for every American per year or something like that. This is just an enormous quantity of material. And, I mentioned how upcycling is not a new idea, and that's because in a lot of ways, it's been common sense in the past. So if you look at whey protein, which is a popular, animal protein in the supplements, industry especially, and fitness and supplements and such, whey protein, WHEY, that's produced from a side stream from cheese making. And somewhat ironically, whey has become so valuable that now there's some producers of whey. I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, to be honest, but this is something that someone in the industry, shared with me, that where they're actually producing whey and cheese is the byproduct, right? So this idea of side stream becoming a co-stream is not radical. It's common sense in a lot of respects, but there are, I almost said countless examples, but we've done doing a good job trying to count how many are actually out there of potential ingredients like brewer's grain that are left behind. And for us, we tend to focus on the processing level where there's these side streams that could be co-streams. So like in beverages, for example, oat milk, for example, certain ways of producing it. The most popular way of producing it produces a pulp that's very high in protein and fiber as well, analogous to what we're doing with brewer's grain. We're doing some work there. But also, if you look globally at products like coffee, where we actually, when we're drinking coffee, we're drinking, a roasted pit effectively of a cherry. The coffee bean is the center of a fruit. That fruit, also known as cascara, has some, interesting properties, and there's upcycling happening with that now. Or the leaf of the coffee plant, or if you look at the chocolate supply chain, there's the cacao fruit, the actual flesh of the fruit itself that very few people have tasted. Really interesting product, by the way. It tastes like a delicious tropical fruit, not like chocolate at all. And it's got some nice health properties as well as flavor and, functional sweetness and things like that. Or the cashew nut and the apple that the cashew grows on the end of. Anyone listening, if you've never seen how a cashew grows on a tree, Google that right now. It's you feel like you're in like Dr. Seuss or something when you see it. It's gonna turn your mind around. And so the whole world of potential of where are all these dots that we can be collecting, right, of food streams that are being lost somewhere along the way. What are all these dots? How can we collect them? And then how can we connect them through to end uses? And a big part of that is, why this hasn't happened before. Because with some like whey, it obviously has happened, right? And others like brewer's grain, no one had commercially cracked the code, on that. And so we had to do a lot of innovation around processing. We had a whole partnership with the USDA, which maybe we'll get into, maybe not. But so it's both it's a market failure, right? Food waste is a market failure. The market has failed to produce the outcome that is optimal for society. Now, the market in this case is quite capable of correction. There's latent value. There's latent supply. There's latent demand. There's latent value in exchange between supply and demand that just needs a catalyst in our view. And we're here to be that catalyst. And today, if you look at our business, while we started as, I started as a home brewer and I was making bread and selling it to friends in order to buy the ingredients to brew more beer for free. Today, we've got Kroger stores who's launched a private label bread that's distributed nationally, that's manufactured by one of the biggest bakeries in the world. So we're now at a point where we're starting to operate at the kind of scale that is going to, we hope, shift the paradigm in how we're thinking about these waste streams as actual latent supply chains. How the end of one supply chain can actually become the beginning of another.
Great. And you said something in there that's, I think, really important, is that it's not just that you're noticing that there's waste in brewery and then looking at the grain and saying, hey, let's drive this over to a bakery and they'll turn it into bread and now we can distribute it nationally, which is an amazing outcome. But there is that innovation piece. So you mentioned innovation. You actually do need to, in order to valorize these waste streams, there is like a creative process, which probably requires some equipment and testing, and there's a manufacturing component to it. And of course, that brings in food quality and all the other concerns that one needs to think about to have an ingredient. And ingredients are this invisible part of, not invisible, but a not often looked at part of the food system. And so you're doing that catalyzing. Maybe you could tell us more about how you go about that catalyzing, and just there's some creative part, some which is truly innovative, but some processing. You have to innovate on like the actual equipment used, or you're able to use off the shelf equipment and just figure out processes, or does it matter what? It probably depends on the ingredient. Can you just unpack the catalyzing part for us a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to your point, like when we got started, we had no idea. We knew that we had what seemed like a real idea, right? But we needed to figure out what barriers were that would need to be overcome to make this a reality. And so there's the supply side of that question, and there's the demand side of that question. And we started with the supply side because one of the things that we learned from honestly decades of scientific papers that had been written about the potential offered by turning what we call the artist formerly known as brewer's spent grain, like so, because it's actually not spent, right? But you just can't make more beer with it. So industrially, it's called brewer's spent grain, or BSG. These articles on the potential for human food products made from it were numerous, and most of them cited processing challenges, which we experienced firsthand because this is a material when it's coming out of the brewery that is up to sometimes 80% moisture content. So to give you an idea, like in apple or something like that. That's, more like 40%. So this is like a very, honestly, the best thing to do is just think about like a bowl of oatmeal. It's like that wet. And that has a number of challenges associated with it. One of which is that wet materials are heavy and difficult to transport. Another is that they have food safety issues, right? So as a wet product sits and comes out of the brewery hot, but as that reaches room temperature, you actually get spoilage, and you get spoilage in less than a day, in about half a day with BSG. It is no longer fit for human consumption. And so we figured the first thing we need to do is figure out, okay, what do we need to do to be able to process it at scale? Because there's lots of wet materials that are dried out there in the economy, right? But there's something unique about the BSG and how much of it is created, the moisture level at which it's created, and the fact that breweries are in the business of making beer, and they're not being wasteful. They've taken what they need from this material. They can't use it to make beer anymore. They need it out so that they can make another batch of beer the next day. And so we, not being engineers ourselves, knew that we needed to get creative about how to do that. And, what we learned about was a division of the USDA, actually, called the ARS, the Agricultural Research Service, which happens to have a regional research center basically in Berkeley, California, in Albany, more specifically. And we brought this to them because they actually had a focus on creating novel plant-based ingredients out of waste streams, which is basically upcycling, right, in a more academic diction. And we said, hey, we've got this great idea. And they're like, oh yeah, we know about BSG. That is a great idea. How can we help? And we said, well, we don't really know how to process this stuff. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's definitely something we can help with. And let's start with a review of different available, solutions that are out there. And it's kind of like the children's story of the bears, and going back to to Porridge Goldilocks, right, where they try something. It's like, oh, okay, this actually works to get it dry, but it uses too much energy. Oh, this works, and the energy efficiency is good, but it's burning the product and leading to negative flavor. There's issues with everything we tested. We ended up actually determining that the best path was a novel application of an infrared-based process that we now have a patent on, that we developed with the USDA under this collaborative research and development agreement, which is a great example of public-private sector partnerships, working together, playing to our strengths to try to solve a real problem and to deliver value to the big picture. And so that was on the supply side. A catalyst that we needed was to know that we could commercially create meaningful quantities of a usable and desirable material for users, right? Food companies that would take an ingredient. And then there was the demand side of the equation, right? So, okay, so we can do this. What's the best thing to make? How do we talk about it? How do we teach people about it? There's a lot to that. And the way that we sought to climb that tree initially was actually to launch our own products. So we created a consumer brand called Regrained that was always had the ambitions of being a stepping stone to selling that ingredient to other companies. And we, being a small bootstrapped company, we started with what we could make by hand, and we made nutrition bars, and we sold those. We got them into a couple thousand stores at one point. We made a snack. We started using our own brand, our own products as a vehicle for education, and that's what led to our insights around different product applications and how to talk about these materials. And, there's really just a lot that came out from that experience. We're no longer making our own consumer products. I don't miss operating that part of the business in a lot of respects. It's really hard to run a CPG brand, but for us, it was a means to an end. And, for us, that end is operating really in the middle of the B2B food value chain, if you will, working with ingredient manufacturers, contract manufacturers, brands, and retailers that pull products through from those and help create new innovation tools for them to develop products that are really at that intersection of being better for you and better for the planet. And that's where we work today.
Let's talk more about the better for you, better for the planet. I think maybe some people might be surprised. I mean, you described it already a little bit but let's take the Regrained, your kind of flagship foundational ingredient. Talk about, is it healthy? It's coming from beer, so maybe people might think, oh, well, beer doesn't sound healthy. But talk about the human health potential of at least maybe that one product and other ingredients potentially. And then I'd also love if you could talk about the environmental and other impacts, greenhouse gas emissions that could be mitigated from recapturing some of these waste streams and valorizing them. And then you already talked about upstream, what happens in the food cycle, but if you could tell us a little bit more about the impact socially and environmentally, that'd be.
Yeah. So to start with the human health impact of this material, just to bust any misconceptions here, because at least in large quantities, beer is certainly not healthy, right, for us. But the grain, the barley, it's mostly barley. There's also some wheat and some rye that are used to make beer. And a macro, for some of these bigger macro breweries, they use sometimes rice and corn as well. But just focusing on the barley for now. But the same principles hold true. When you're extracting sugars from something, you're desugaring it. Yeah, and so what's left is didn't mean to have a tautological sentence there, right? Well, when you extract the sugars from something, there's no sugars in it. Really what I'm looking to point us towards is an understanding that means that what's left is actually concentrated, right? So, just like your whole wheat flour has fiber and protein and starch, sugar, so does this barley. So once that sugar component is removed, it's all fiber and protein pretty much. So brewer's grain, after it's been used to brew, is up to 30% protein by weight, which is more than twice quinoa, for example. It's also upwards of 40% dietary fiber, which is like 4 times a whole wheat flour. We pay a lot of attention to protein in the health market, but almost nobody is protein deficient. Really, almost everybody is fiber deficient. And so, yes, this is a source of plant protein, and that's important, and we care about that. We're excited about the potential, to bring plant-based protein derived from what would otherwise be a waste stream to market, absolutely. But the fiber component specifically is one that arguably has the greater human health positive, potential positive impact. A bakery can take standard bread formula and pull in 15% or so of the recipe to bring in our ingredient, and it will fortify that product to get to a fiber claim, to either 3 gram or 5 gram per serving, which are the FDA approved designations for good source and an excellent source of fiber. Now, on a deeper level, the human nutrition side of things, the fiber component that's specifically there's a lot of different kinds of fiber that are out there. And there's a prebiotic component as well of the fiber. And so, if you make kombucha, you probably like the probiotic properties of that, right? So that's about bringing good bugs into your gut, basically, right? And what they eat, their food, their flora to the fauna of the probiotic is prebiotic fiber. And this material is rich in prebiotic fiber as well. For any I know it's more of a sustainability oriented show. So for anyone who wants to get more into the nutritional, side of it, we'd love to hear from you and provide you more information as to the numerous health benefits associated with this source of nutrition. Shifting to the second part of your question around the positive impacts on the planet, just taking a step back, food waste generally, this is an often cited statistic. So if you've looked into food waste, you've probably seen something like this. Like if you were to actually measure the greenhouse gas emissions from food waste as a country, it would rank the 3rd largest emitter globally after the US and China. That's because food, like all organic materials, when they end up in a landfill type environment, they break down into methane, which is 20 plus times more potent than CO2, right? So food waste reduction is widely recognized to be one of the top levers we have in the fight against the climate crisis, right? So this is everything that is happening with upcycling is happening within that context of food waste reduction. Drilling down a level, when you're looking at food waste reduction, there's a great resource put out by the EPA called the it's the Food Recovery Hierarchy. It's like kind of looks like the nutritional pyramid from our youth, showing different levels of cascading uses that are optimal. And feeding people is at the very top of that. And below feeding people is feeding animals. Below feeding animals are things like anaerobic digestion. Below that are things like compost to create soil amendments, such, and like obviously at the very bottom is landfill. And so with upcycling, really what we're doing is we're looking at materials that would have otherwise gone to a lower consumption destination to animal feed or anaerobic digestion or compost or landfill, and instead routing them to the highest possible use of feeding people. So when you look even more specifically down at the level of brewers grain specifically, in the U.S. Fortunately, most of it is going to at least to animal feed uses. About 80% is going to animal feed. About 20% are going to destinations like landfill, with the exception being places that have municipal compost. And there's very few other uses for brewers grain that are done at a meaningful scale besides animal feed and landfill. It's about 80% to animal feed. And so, this is about taking something from that lower use and putting it to a higher use. And doing that, going back to the point earlier about resource conservation. If you look at water, for example, as a important, to say the least, resource to supporting life on Earth. Water in the beer brewing process, you'd think, oh, beer is a liquid. That's where a lot of the water comes in. But it's actually about 90% of the water footprint of beer is in the agricultural supply chain of the barley itself. And it takes 1 pound of grain to produce approximately 1 6-pack of beer on average. That 1 pound of grain, again, on average, is using between 300, 350 gallons of water per pound, like the equivalent of a 2-hour shower, effectively, for just the water footprint of just the grain that goes in the beer making process. And so there's a common sense argument around, when you give something second life, you're effectively creating, in this case, we're creating, a source of food without the use of additional water. And then from a carbon footprint perspective, that's important too. And, there are some challenges in the measurement of that at the current scale of a lot of the upcycled industry, in that many processors, including ours, compared to the full potential, are operating at a relatively small scale today. But even at the small scale today, looking at our LCA, we still come out favorable against virgin ingredients, but it's going to be an order of magnitude, greater, as we're producing larger volumes. And key to that is the scale-up plan, for at least our business, for producing, involves co-location. So actually putting our equipment on site or right next to the source. And so then you're reducing the transport, which is a big driver of the footprint in upcycled products. So across the board, while there's always improvements to be made as we grow, and this is just a common sense practice. It's good for business to find value in waste streams. It's good for people to eat, healthier products, and it's better for the environment to find food where it's already being produced and really optimize. Find ways to do more with less, or as one of my friends friend and peer in the industry likes to say, find ways to do more with more. Taking that more expanded look, at that. It's that ethos really that is what drives the upcycled food movement. And when you look at the industry nonprofit, the Upcycled Food Association, and the members in it, and the certification standard that was developed, and others, I believe it's actually up to thousands of products that are certified. I haven't seen the latest count on that. This is the standard deliberately is written in a way to try to avoid greenwashing, right? And people taking a look at common existing business practices and saying, oh, this is upcycled, right? But maybe it's a hot dog or something like that. So the definition of and the standard that was built around that for upcycled foods, take a look at producing them in ways that make a net positive impact on the environment. And purpose is a big part of what unites the innovators, the founders that are operating in this space that we're in.
That's really helpful. And for listeners that might not be familiar, Daniel mentioned like life cycle assessment and the boundaries here, which there's a lot of nuance in that. And I don't know what the LCA life cycle assessment boundaries the standard uses, but you mentioned upstream, looking into agriculture. Water is a great example. A lot of water is used in agriculture, arable crops, barley as an example. But of course, there's a water energy nexus. There's a lot of pumping and pressurization and electricity and greenhouse gas emissions related to water. There's biodiversity impacts related to the water. There's, of course, a lot of barley is grown with herbicides and pesticides, and whether for beer or other grains that would have been needed to produce bread. So there's a question of like, okay, if you're displacing some wheat grain in bread, then, do you get to claim credit for the displacement of all of the emissions and cultural eutrophication from the upstream impact of agriculture on waterways related to the production of wheat that doesn't have to happen? And maybe not yet, like you're saying, there's an order of magnitude kind of turnover that might happen once you move into, you said there's like a gigatons, I think there's billions of tons of material in America alone, not to mention the rest of the world. But there's so many different pieces where careful upcycling, I like the way you said the standard was written, that you're looking for something that's lower in the pyramid and displacing that to something that's higher in terms of the hierarchy of use. Because even something like animal feed, well, I'm imagining, I don't know this for a fact, but most of the brewery grains are probably used for animal feed and probably confined operations, which we know have terrible footprint, not to mention animal welfare. I could be wrong about that. But this question of like, where do you get to draw the lines? You want to make sure your assertions, you can back them up and not to be hyperbolic. But I imagine when you look at that upcycle field, the second and third order effects of actually having something that's more closed loop and bioregional with low transport, you can have this vision where there's like eco-industrial parks where we just take our food waste locally and process it to the best possible highest use, better for people, the environment, and for, like you said, our economy and the way we meet our needs. So I just wanted to highlight that you brought up something very important there. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments a lot. And as a sustainability nerd, I love to go down those different rabbit holes as you take that, expanded look at first degree, second degree, third degree. And, but then sometimes all I want to do is just grab the conversation by the shoulders and shake it a little bit and be like, hey, let's just remember that fundamentally what we're talking about here is very simple. Let's make sure that we are eating the food that we're producing. And so, especially in today's day and age where there's increased focus, especially in the corporate world, on ESG and on the public commitments, and everyone's got all these targets that they're working towards in 2030 or 2040 or 2050 or all of the above. And a lot of what we're doing, this work that we're doing, if we're working with a major food brand, they're able to connect the dots between their product development and some of their external ESG commitments. And that can be a really powerful thing. And we support the quantification of that. Absolutely. But I also think it's just important to re-ground ourselves in the simplest terms that we can here, which is that this work that we're doing is simply the right thing to do. We're talking about improving the way that we are feeding the planet, making sure that the food that we're producing and all the resources that go into it actually go to feeding people, period. Argue with me on that.
I can't talk you down on that one, Daniel. In a world where there's tragically 800 million, 900 million people who are malnourished and hungry yesterday, today, and tomorrow, where we produce 2x the number of calories, not all the nutrition necessarily, but we overproduce globally. And yet we gnash our teeth about how are we going to feed a world of 10 billion people and all the forests that need to be cut down and blah, blah, blah. I want to shake people by the shoulders as well. I'm right there with you.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think it's important to recognize, especially in the context of this show, that food waste does not cause hunger, right? But at the same time, how might we address food waste in a way to create accessible nutrition that can be used to serve the food insecure, right? I mean, it's something that we think about a lot. I mean, yeah, we've got some customers that create higher end products that are distributed into Whole Foods, and that's places like that are, I guess, more on the premium end of the spectrum. But for us, our mission is about unearthing accessible nutrition. And, again, waste does not cause hunger, right? There's a lot that goes into the fact that, what is it, like 1 in 7 Americans are food insecure, not even to look at the global figures for that. But there is a bridge to be built between those twin problems and a solution that unites them. And it's something that we get really energized and passionate about when we think about the potential that we can work towards as a player in the space to move the needle on that.
Is there anything you want to tell us, the listeners, about the company in terms of the not just the products you create, but as a company? I know you are thoughtful about thinking about designing the company to optimize impacts even within in terms of the well-being of your team and the workers and all of your stakeholders. Is there anything you want to say about things you're proud about or things you're working on or just the impact of the company as an entity?
Yeah, we're a proud B Corp for starters. That's something that we pretty much from the beginning decided would be, core to how we would operate. We're B Corp and we're also a public benefit corporation. And so we actually have coded into our corporate documents that we consider all stakeholders, not just shareholders. So that's certainly something we're proud about. We've also been longstanding members of 1% for the planet, which is a cause that we really believe in. I like the way in which it is about creating a mechanism to actually funnel money to localized causes, not just, if you're not familiar with 1% for the planet, look it up. It's a really great organization. We've also done some unusual things that I'd have to say I'm proud of as a mission-led founder. One is the way in which we've raised capital, in the early days, included actually 2 rounds of equity crowdfunding. So as soon as that became something that was possible, I believe it was 2018, maybe after the Jobs Act, I think it was 2016, but then like the platforms and stuff really started. You might know this better than I do, Kevin, in terms of when it became possible.
Obama signed the Jobs Act in 2009, but it took a while for the rulemaking to come around and then the platforms to emerge. So it was a slow thing, but yeah.
Yeah, it became practical to do it as a business. Well, marginally practical, I guess I would have to say. We did our first one in I think it was 2017, maybe it was 2018. We democratized our cap table effectively, and we have corporate VCs sitting on our cap table as well. We've, aligned with groups like Griffith Foods and Molson Coors, and, that serves its own area to be proud of in terms of strategy and mission and scale. But we also have over 1,000 normal investors, people that would have otherwise not had access to own our mission and our success with us. And so we're really proud to have done that. And I'm always eager to connect with other founders that are interested in Reg CF or Reg D. Be too technical, but the different types of raises that could be done. With that, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about it, and it's something that I'm just a big believer in. Gosh, that's I'll leave that there. Of course, I could share more about what we're doing commercially today and some of the customers that are coming on with. I mentioned this at the top of the show, but I'll circle back to it now. There's a lot of brands that have emerged where upcycling is their core focus, and we think that's wonderful. We were among the first to do that, and it's fabulous to see the innovation that's happening when you walk the floors of a big trade show like Expo West, for example, and the up and coming brands that are really hanging their hat on this idea of upcycling. Love that. Commercially, we are focused on conventional brands and trying to help them understand the opportunity about how they can actually upcycle too, because this is a solution for everyone. And I think it's an example with Kroger and their private label bread, is a good example of that coming to life. And there's smaller brands too that we're working with, like there's an edible cookie dough company called Dope, or there's an English muffin brand called Stone and Skillet, or Middle Eastern bakery called Torius. These are companies that are making great products, and they have manufacturing capacity, they have distribution, they have their own story to tell. And by helping them understand that they can activate the strategy around upcycling, around using their sourcing and their product development, and using that aspect of their business to do good, external to their business, can be really powerful and can be really good for business too. I guess that's another point that I would bring up to your open-ended question.
Is there anything you want to tell us about what's next, or things that are inspiring you? Kind of thoughts about the future or things you're tracking?
Yeah, if this is the first time you're hearing about upcycling, you're going to start seeing it everywhere. And I'm really excited about the potential of this idea to transcend a lot of the existing trends that are out there, because you can be plant-based and upcycled. You can be keto and upcycled. If you look at a lot of the trends that are driving food right now, they can be accomplished in a way that is also reducing waste elsewhere in the system. And so in some ways, what's next is already here with that. And it doesn't require multiple breakthroughs in processing technology. And yes, like everything, it requires, there's venture capital, and, ideas need to get funded for sure. And it's a tough environment for that, for a lot of folks out there. But yeah, I think this intersection of accessible nutrition and waste reduction, this is the direction that we have to head. And, I think for those of us who have been paying attention to the history of the food industry, it is, I'll go back to this idea that it is this example of what's old is new again, but maybe it's, new again with refreshed focus on doing, at least in part, doing the right thing because it's simply the right thing to do. It makes sense. It makes sense across the board. I'm very eager to connect with anyone listening to this that wants to get involved. It's a big space. It's a growing space, and everyone's welcome.
Well, thanks, Daniel, for taking time out to share with the Next Economy Now listeners your story and how you were struck by an idea that seemed like common sense and maybe should be common sense, but there's a tenacity to pursuing it, finding the right partners, hanging in there through ups and downs and the fundraising cycle to move things forward. To take an idea and make it real is challenging, even if it is common sense. Maybe even especially when it's common sense. There's so many distortions in our economy that perpetuate this business as usual exploitation of people and planet. And taking a stand and figuring it out, doing the innovation and catalyzing, starting a nonprofit trade association, inviting other people in, proselytizing, evangelizing a message that's really important. All that's really hard. So I just want to thank you for hanging in there. And I look forward to myself, Lift Economy, and all the Next Economy Now listeners tracking Up Inc. and Upcycled Foods and everything that you're doing. Any last words for our listeners to close out this episode, Daniel?
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you providing the platform really to spread the message. So greatly appreciated. Eat up.
Eat up. All right. Thanks, Daniel.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Before you go, we wanted to let you know that our spring cohort of the Next Economy MBA begins on March 26th. If you're an entrepreneur seeking to create a business that works for all life, a member of a team looking to transition your organization into one that is more regenerative and democratic, or someone who's considering a career or livelihood transition and embodiment with your values, we designed this course for you. Over this 9-month learning journey, you'll have the chance to learn practical skills around business and life design based on our work with over 250 social enterprises. In addition to live sessions, you can deepen your experience and practice with special sessions, affinity groups, and connections with over 500 alumni who have participated in the course. Interested in learning more? Visit lifteconomy.com/MBA to view our course curriculum and sign up for a free intro with one of our facilitators. If you're ready to sign up, you can use the code PODCASTMBA to save 10% on tuition. We hope you'll join us.